A statement that has shocked public opinion was recently released by Senator Bernie Sanders, the American politician who stated that the American people were deceived about what happened in Vietnam and Iraq. The most shocking point in Mr. Sanders' speech was his direct naming of the systemic deception by US administrations. From the perspective of a long-time Washington politician, he asserted that the American people were dragged into senseless wars based on fabricated reasons. Looking back at 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was sophisticatedly staged as a pretext to escalate the war, bomb the North, and deploy US ground forces to Vietnam. More recently, in 2003, the story of weapons of mass destruction and the false connection between Saddam Hussein's regime and Al-Qaeda became the excuse for Washington to attack a sovereign nation like Iraq. Senator Sanders bluntly concluded these were all entirely fabricated events. For a politician of his stature, admitting this is not only an act of courage, but also a sign of respect for justice and historical truth, values that the Vietnamese press and people have consistently upheld for decades. Turning back the pages of history to 1972, at the height of the Vietnamese People's Resistance War against the US, Bernie Sanders, then running for governor of Vermont, made deeply conscientious statements. He bravely stood before American students to affirm that the Vietnamese people were not the enemies of Americans. His description of the Vietnamese people at that time was both authentic and moving. The past in Iran. The current conflict is pushing America into a new quagmire from which it cannot extricate itself. The consequences are not just the deaths of American soldiers on foreign battlefields, but also a global economic shock. As fuel prices soar and energy and fertilizer supply chains break down due to hostilities in the Strait of Hormuz, those suffering the heaviest consequences are the people in poor nations. Once again, military interventionism is revealing its selfish nature, prioritizing the profit-grabbing of armed syndicates regardless of world stability. Bernie Sanders is the only senator who does not belong to any party. He stands outside the partisan calculations of the US two-party system. Throughout 50 years of experience in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, he has understood to his core how both the Democratic and Republican parties operate. No matter who takes power, the final destination is often to protect the interests of crony interest groups. For this reason, he is always the first to speak out in opposition. The respect both parties have for him does not come from policy consensus, but from his absolute consistency. A month after the US-Israeli war against Iran broke out, one should not be misled by the illusion that Mr. Trump's talk of negotiations promises an early end to the conflict. On the contrary, negotiations or the display of terms to end the war, as the US invasion of Vietnam showed, is simply another front where war is conducted. Typically, when two sides present completely different conditions as the basis for negotiation, each seeks to strengthen their leverage by inflicting greater losses on the opponent. The side with the military advantage will try to crush the opponent to force a collapse or surrender, while the weaker side seeks to increase the price the attacker must pay if the war continues. Both sides understand that nothing can be won at the negotiating table if it has not been won on the battlefield, but both also see the benefit in appearing ready for peace. Let us remember that President Nixon carpet-bombed Hanoi and Haiphong for 11 days in December 1972 in hopes of forcing the Vietnamese side to accept his terms in ongoing negotiations. These bombings killed approximately 2,000 Vietnamese civilians and were called terrorism on an unprecedented scale by the New York Times. However, they failed to force Vietnam to surrender. This often makes people forget that the US can use violence as its own form of negotiation. It is true that Trump extended the deadline for the threat to bomb Iran's power grid. He might follow through or he might not, as Mr. Trump has never proven himself to be a reliable negotiating partner, but that only concerns one specific tactic. There remain many other targets to bomb. However, overall, the campaign to shatter Iran, despite causing significant damage, has yet to show signs of achieving US objectives. So far, US, Goals have been hindered by the Iranian system maintaining its cohesion and ability to continue missile and drone retaliatory strikes despite a month of US and Israeli bombing and decapitation strikes, along with Iran's surprising vertical escalation capability, which continues to cause significant damage to US facilities in the region, including early warning, radar systems, and even apparently an aircraft carrier, as well as to Israel, where media control keeps the full extent of the damage from the public. For the leadership in Washington, Iran remains an existential and strategic threat. Several key factors drive the US toward military intervention: the increased rate of uranium enrichment, Iran's ongoing nuclear development programs, and the threat it is perceived to pose to Israel. Additionally, Iran's abundant natural resources and its pivotal role as a strategic partner to China and Russia provide further impetus for US containment policies. Analyzing recent US foreign policy, the most important driver appears to be Iran's provision of oil, gas, and other resources at preferential prices to China, thereby strengthening the Beijing-Tehran axis to the detriment of US interests. For Donald Trump, China remains the primary adversary. The administration's efforts to weaken Beijing's global influence have intensified, seen in the intervention in Venezuela in January 2026 and increasing diplomatic pressure on Panama to reclaim local ports from Chinese state-owned enterprises. Simultaneously, Washington's efforts to recalibrate relations with Russia suggest a strategy to detach China from its strongest ally. Within this framework, neutralizing Iran serves two goals: directly advancing US interests by cutting off a vital resource supply to China, while creating a regional vacuum for Israel to expand its strategic depth and influence. Under these conditions, a military strike on Iran is viewed by some in Washington as not only feasible but strategically necessary. The legacy of the war of aggression in Vietnam remains the most painful chapter in US military history. The memory of a costly retreat without achieving strategic goals, the Vietnam syndrome, continues to haunt US foreign policy. A confrontation with Iran could recreate this scenario. Iran's military political potential, the proxy forces of the Axis of Resistance, and its regional support network make it a resilient opponent, significantly reducing the likelihood of a quick US victory. Washington's goal is often a lightning strike that yields immediate results. However, if a campaign expected to last 3 to 10 days fails to reach its targets and turns into a prolonged war of attrition with high casualties, the consequences for the Trump administration's credibility and political survival would be catastrophic. In that case, the ambition of a great America could be destroyed by the very conflict intended to assert its power. A US attack might win a battle, but risks losing the war. Iran could very well become a second Vietnam for the US, an exhausting quagmire that drains resources, erodes domestic support, and exposes the limits of American power. With its vast network of underground tunnels, missile launchers, and an autonomous defense industry, Iran is equipped for a protracted conflict. Iran's strategy appears to be drawing the US into a ground war where American air superiority and AI advantages would be neutralized by the brutal reality of urban warfare and insurgency.